Because of all of the controversy with Nanotyrannus with the juvenile T-Rex, I put up an exhibit, or we put up an exhibit here, kind of showing you that, you know, like for instance, these are all the claws from the thumb and from this finger that we have from Nanotyrannus. These are what we have from T-Rex. And these are 3 hands from T-Rex, including Sue and MR5 or MR980, which is Pex Rex. The biggest hands we know, and there's 1 hand from, we have both, this specimen has both hands, and then the Dueling Dinosaurs does too. Every last bone we have that we know of for Nanotyrannus is bigger, actually not proportionally, but actually bigger than every hand bone we know from Tyrannosaurus Rex. And lots more teeth in the jaws, different shaped teeth, lots and lots of, there's like, skull alone has 47 different characters to tell you it's not a juvenile T-Rex.
When you make a hypothesis in science, you try to disprove it, not try to prove what you said. So if you can't disprove it, then it's true, then it's probably true.
All right, let me just say that I never thought that I would be talking about this subject. It seemed as if everyone had already made up their minds. I put this alongside, like, Spinosaurus and stuff like that, and I tucked it away in a box, and I shoved it under my bed, and I said, this is something that I was never going to discuss, because it seemed like any time that anybody ever questioned the consensus on this topic, it was something that would basically cause you to give up any little shred of credibility that you had. But unlike with Spinosaurus, this was something that always lingered in the back of my brain. I've traveled all over the United States and I've spoken to experts on both sides of this, and for a long time, I honestly just had the opinion of, I don't know. Because for a long time, both sides had good points. But now, with recent discoveries that have been made, it's finally time to talk about it. So, let's talk about Nanotyrannus. The dinosaur that, despite being gone for 66 million years and being memed into irrelevance, just won't stay dead. And this time, it looks like it's finally here to stay. For those of you who don't know, some new research just came out that kind of blew open this debate all over again. And this time, it seems like this is really the smoking gun that people have been looking for a long time. Like, this is reigniting a debate that has been going on since the late 80s. All stemming from several fragmentary specimens of Tyrannosaurs that were found throughout the Hell Creek and Lance formations in western North America. These are formations where, like, 80% of the dinosaurs that most people are familiar with come from. Almost everybody's favorites, things like Ankylosaurus and Triceratops and Pachycephalosaurus and Edmontosaurus, and those were just the big names. This is actually one of the most comprehensive fossil layers in the world. This gives us a really fantastic idea of what the food web was like during the very end of the age of dinosaurs. And sitting at the very top of this food web is perhaps one of the most famous dinosaurs of all, Tyrannosaurus Rex. T-Rex is by far the biggest and most massive terrestrial carnivore that has ever lived. Normally, this would be the part where I would try to make a comparison between an extinct animal and something alive today. But I really can't do that here. There really is nothing to compare T-Rex to. We're talking about a 7-ton super predator with armor-piercing rounds the size of bananas for teeth. But honestly, even with all of these weapons, the life of a T-Rex wasn't easy. T-Rex was the monster of the Cretaceous that it was because it had to hunt some of the most powerful herbivores that have ever lived. It made its living hunting all of the animals that I just listed. And even though people like to think of Edmontosaurus as helpless T-Rex fodder, Clint, the truth is, Edmontosaurus was the second largest animal in Hell Creek, second only to Alamosaurus, a titanosaur, which would have likely been the only animal that T-Rex would have avoided most of the time. The point is, T-Rex was this super adapted predator specifically built for hunting this well-armored prey. And it was good at what it did. It was the top predator in North America for around 3 million years. The thing is, like I said, the Hell Creek and Lance formations give us a very good idea of the thriving ecosystem at this time and place, in an age called the Maastrichtian. And although we love to talk about the giants of this time, not everything was a 30-plus foot behemoth. We have everything from small lizards, snakes, turtles, mammals, and birds, to small dinosaurs, both herbivores and carnivores, and several medium-sized dinosaurs like the oviraptorid Anzu and the previously mentioned Pachycephalosaurus. But one thing was missing. We had little prey and small predators to hunt them, lots of big prey and the one big super predator, and several medium-sized prey species, but no mid-sized predator to hunt those. This was confusing because many of these prey species were too big for the small predators, but also they would have been fast running and honestly at their size would have been more trouble than they're worth for T-Rex. So what was hunting these medium-sized animals? There appeared to be a gap in this food web. But one day, within the Lance Formation, the remains of a carnivorous dinosaur was found that, one way or another, would fill that gap. The first specimens of this animal were collected in 1942 and described in 1946 by Charles Gilmore. What was clear was that these were the remains of a tyrannosaur of some type. But unfortunately, that was all that was really clear. The holotype specimen was a skull, with no real postcranial remains at all. So, just a head, but still a pretty well-preserved head. Gilmore thought that it looked most like an already known tyrannosaur called Gorgosaurus from Canada, but it was still different enough to be considered a separate species. It also being around 10 million years more recent than most of the Gorgosaurus fossils found. So it was given the species name Gorgosaurus lancensis. This specimen, which being housed at the Cleveland Museum, has since been referred to as the Cleveland skull. So going forward, we're just going to call this one Cleveland.
Hey, y'all!
But without much else to go on, it really wasn't given much thought after that. That is, until 42 years later when Robert Bacher published a paper in 1988, and first proposed that this was different enough from all known tyrannosaurs to be a completely separate genus. And it is he that first coined the term Nanotyrannus, keeping the species name Lancensis. But an interesting fact was that this specimen was found to not be fully grown. And that right there is where the validity of this being a separate genus would be called into question. You see, this being the only specimen, that meant that at the time we had no adult Nanotyrannus remains. But there was another Tyrannosaur from the same place and time that we had quite a lot of material of. A much larger, more famous Tyrannosaur. But despite having so many specimens, there was still something missing from the fossil record of T-Rex. We didn't have any juveniles. So to some, this skull filled that spot. And this was the argument proposed by Thomas Carr. And this made sense. But there was a lot of interesting differences between this skull and a T-Rex skull. If you look at them next to each other, you can see that proportionally, the T-Rex skull is obviously bigger, but it's also much taller. Also, the number of teeth are different, with the larger skull having less teeth. And those teeth weren't even shaped the same, with the smaller skull having teeth shaped better for cutting, more flat and razor sharp, rather than the railroad spikes of the T-Rex. Those who argued that this skull belonged to an adolescent Rex thought that these changes could potentially have been happening as the T-Rex grew. So really, from the moment that Nanotyrannus was first named, its validity as a separate genus from its larger cousin was hotly debated. And because of lacking fossil remains, this would continue to be a fight for almost 4 decades. So, in the years from 1988 until now, there have been quite a few other specimens that have added fuel to this fire, but there was always something that made it hard to say that this was really the smoking gun one way or another. What we needed was either a specimen of a Tyrannosaur from Hell Creek or the Lance Formation that was around half the size of T-Rex and showed signs that it was definitely fully grown, or a juvenile Tyrannosaurus Rex that was definitely not Nanotyrannus. And the better the specimen, the more sure we could be. But for a long time, that specimen continued to elude science. Now, I won't be able to go over every single fragmentary specimen here, because there's actually a ton of them. But the next really beautiful specimen that really got the controversy going again was found in southern Montana in 2001. Nicknamed Jane, this animal's skull was nearly identical to the original specimen. But unlike with Cleveland, this specimen was much more complete, with around 50% of the skeleton there. With this, we were able to glean a lot more about what this animal looked like, whatever it was. And it painted a picture that, although it was still definitely a Tyrannosaur, it was pretty different from T-Rex. At around 6.5 meters or 21 to 22 feet long, and around a ton in weight, so around the same length as Utah Raptor, but more heavy, and it was also definitely taller. So in other words, this was a lot more of a gracile animal similar to a large dromaeosaur. Pretty different from the robust bruiser that was T-Rex. But, of course, there was a problem. You see, Jane, like Cleveland before her, was a juvenile, believed to be around 11 years old when she died. As great of a specimen as this was, it was still hard to say whether or not this animal could change from this to this in the 40-ish years of a T-Rex's lifespan. And this is when names like Phil Curry and Pete Larson got into the argument. Pete Larson being a name that I definitely want to highlight. He was the one who I shared the clip of at the start of the video, and that's actually going to be important for the next part. The next big find would come up in 2006, when another fossil was found in the Hell Creek Formation of northeastern Montana. And this was an absolutely exquisite fossil. It showed a ceratopsian and a theropod possibly locked together in combat, but they were definitely buried together. It actually puts me in mind of the famous fighting dinosaurs fossil from the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. Only instead of being a theropod the size of a coyote and a ceratopsian the size of a sheep, this was a triceratops and a tyrannosaur that was around 17 feet long. And that number is actually important to remember for later, because this animal is smaller than Jane, and presumably Cleveland. And even more importantly, this specimen was around 98% complete. Basically, it was just missing a claw. For comparison, Sue, one of the most famously complete T-Rex specimens ever found, was around 90% complete. So regardless of what this specimen was, this is a massively important fossil. This was the exact fossil that was needed to settle this debate forever. But, of course, there was another problem. You see, this fossil was not found and excavated by a museum. It was found on a private ranch. It was excavated by private fossil hunters, led by Clayton Phillips and prepared by CK Preparations. They knew that what they had was very special, but the circumstances of its discovery made it a little bit problematic. And because of this fossil would go largely unknown until 2011, when the ranchers enlisted the help of Pete Larson in campaigning to sell this piece. And when Pete saw this fossil, he noticed a lot of things that really stood out to him. And I would argue that there's actually very few people who know Tyrannosaurus Rex better than Pete Larson. A huge portion of the T-Rex specimens that people have ever heard of were found by him and Black Hills Institute, including both Sue and Stan. Stan being one of the most reproduced tyrannosaurs in the world. If you see a museum specimen of a T-Rex where the skeleton is standing up, I would say there's like an 80% chance that you're looking at a reproduction of Stan. And one of the things that really stood out to Pete, besides the gracile, long-legged build, more narrow snout, and more numerous blade-like teeth that we've already discussed, was the arms. These arms were longer, but not just proportionately longer than T-Rex's arms. arms, but the arm and hand bones of this 20-foot-long animal were physically longer than what he had seen in the dozens of 40-foot T-Rex specimens, which means that if this was a juvenile T-Rex, that would mean that its arms would have to shrink as its head doubled in size and its body mass 10x'd in size. And this has always been the part of this argument that kind of stood out to me and made me think to myself, you know, maybe we don't have this all the way figured out. Because I've known Pete for over 10 years, and we've had this discussion numerous times, but alas, there was still that whole problem of ownership to deal with. You see, because this fossil was found on private land and excavated and prepared by private individuals, it then begs the question, where does it go? And I know that there's going to be people in the comments already typing, it belongs in a museum, and to that I say, yes, you are technically correct, it should go to a museum, but also, the private individuals who did all of the work do deserve some sort of compensation and credit. Do I think that fossils should be sold at auction for 7 or 8 figures? No, absolutely not. Because when you do that, you create a situation where museums are essentially priced out of the fossils that they need for us to understand these animals, and essentially at that point only the ultra rich can afford to get them. And that's not okay either. But most people who think that these fossils should just be given to museums, I would argue that most of you probably have not gone out to the desert and dug up a dinosaur fossil. The process is a lot of work, and this is technically a chunk of these ranchers' property. And I'm not going to sit here and say that there is an easy answer to this question. I only want to present that there is, in fact, 2 sides to this argument. In the case of this situation, the owners of this fossil reached out to a few different high-end museums, and they were unable to come to an agreement. Which really sucked because, like I said, this was exactly the fossil that we needed to settle this debate. And in 2013, Pete Larson attempted to present this Tyrannosaur, which was now nicknamed Bloody Mary, as the best evidence available to the validity of Nanotyrannus. But at this point, because it was a privately owned fossil, this sparked a massive debate on whether or not a privately owned fossil should be used for scientific study. Much of the academic community was against it, and Larson's findings went largely ignored. So sadly, this fossil was slated to be sold at auction to a private buyer. And despite being one of the most remarkable fossils ever found, somehow it still went unsold. And although Nanotyrannus was never officially declared a Nobis Dubium, this is the point in the story where it kind of became a bit of a meme. The public collectively decided that this animal was just an attempt at slapping a name on what was obviously a juvenile T-Rex. And any real answers were going to require another specimen, at least for now. Now, during the time that the Dueling Dinosaurs situation was unfolding, there were a couple other interesting specimens that I feel need to be brought up. The first one being Baby Bob. Now, you could be forgiven for not being familiar with Baby Bob, because this specimen admittedly does have some issues. The first one being the same situation as the Dueling Dinosaurs in that this was, once again, part of a private collection. So science does not actually have access to it. But unlike Bloody Mary, Baby Bob also looks like this. Yeah, that's all of it. This specimen is actually only around 20% complete. But this is a juvenile Tyrannosaurus that is actually thought to only be around 4 years old. And then we have Chomper. This adorable little fellow was found by Lee Hall and has been housed at the Museum of the Rockies since 2010. But Chomper was different. Unlike Jane and Bloody Mary and Baby Bob, Chomper was a baby. Like a baby. Believed to only be around 2 years old. And as you would expect, this was a much smaller individual than any of the animals that we've talked about. So none of these could really fill the exact hole in the puzzle here. And without the dueling dinosaurs to study, Jane became widely accepted as this missing piece, creating a pretty interesting hypothesis about how this animal could have been filling in the missing mid-sized predator role in the Hell Creek environment. Basically, the answer was T-Rex. What was proposed was that Tyrannosaurus Rex was more or less the only mega predator on the landscape of late Cretaceous Laramidia. And as it grew, it would go from a faster pursuit predator with slashing teeth and longer legs and arms to an adult, which was the giant monster predator specialized in killing large, well-armored prey. Basically, partitioning into different niches as it grew and filling every possible predator role that wasn't chasing small squirrel-sized animals. Or maybe Chomper was chasing those too, who knows. The trouble with this idea is that we don't normally see stuff like this happen in nature, and we don't normally see these extreme physical changes taking place, especially in vertebrates. Like, this is the kind of thing that we only generally see in things like insects, amphibians, and Pokemon. And it should also be mentioned that although no other specimens of juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex have turned up from the Lancer Hell Creek Formation, we have found juveniles of other Tyrannosaur species from elsewhere like Tarbosaurus and Gorgosaurus. And it doesn't seem like the tooth count or shape was changing a whole lot in the progression from adolescent to adult. Like, there's a little bit, but nothing like what we see comparing Cleveland, Jane, and Bloody Mary to any adult Rex. But despite all of this, this was widely accepted for the past decade that this is what this was. Now that we're all caught up with everything up to the newest discoveries, I feel like we need to take a little intermission. And honestly, like I said at the beginning of the video, I didn't think that this was ever going to come up. But I've wanted to say this for a long time. In the field of paleontology, we do not have the luxury that a lot of other fields of science have. In zoology, we can actually go out and study what these animals are like in life. We can see how they interact with their environment and where they fit into their ecosystem. Nobody has ever seen a living non-avian dinosaur. We are making educated hypotheses based on what is left. And in some cases, we have been blessed with multiple individual specimens, where we can look at what we have and compare it to living animals and make even more educated hypotheses about what they were like. And then sometimes, we just have crumbs. But even in those blessed cases where we have literal tons of material to go through, we will never know everything about an animal that has been gone for 66 million years. Our understanding of natural history is constantly changing. When we first learned about dinosaurs, we thought they looked like this. As a science communicator, I've been asked about this several times, along with Spinosaurus, and the debate about Stygimoloch and Dracorex being an adolescent Pachy. Hell, that's the main subject that I talked about when I did that video with Clint on Clint's Reptiles. But every single time I'm asked, I always give the same answer. It's okay to say that we don't know the answers to everything. And if this whole Nanotyrannus thing can teach us anything, it's that. Because paleontology and the paleo community collectively threw this out the window for a long time. But when I looked at the evidence, I admittedly saw merit in both sides of this argument. On one hand, if you look at baby birds compared to adult birds, they do change a great deal as they mature. But I was shown this display case of fossils years ago by Pete Larson. Those arms. That was the thing that I really couldn't get past. And the scientist part of my brain just kept telling me, if there's any reason for doubt, never say that you're sure of anything. But unfortunately, as long as the dueling dinosaur specimen remained locked away, this mystery was going to linger in the back of a few people's minds while the rest of the world already made up theirs. 2020. Good year, said no one ever. But while we were all dealing with our own extinction event, something big was going to happen that was going to change paleontology forever. With the help of several donors, the North Carolina Museum was able to purchase the Dueling dinosaur specimen. And for the first time since the early 2010s, it was made available for study. And once they had this fossil, Lindsay Zano and James Napoli began gathering data from it, as well as compiling everything from around 200 other Tyrannosaur specimens to hopefully put this to bed once and for all. And from everything that I've read and seen, it seems like they really did come at this with absolutely no bias one way or another. At the end of the day, whether this was a new species or genus or not, this was a very important fossil. At 98% complete, it was one of the most complete theropod fossils ever found. And now, after 5 years of gathering everything we know on this topic, we finally have an answer. This is not a T-Rex. And there is a ton of stuff to go over with this, and even more that will be coming out in the future, but this really is Nanotyrannus. We know this for sure because of everything that we've talked about with the teeth, the skull shape, the limb proportions, and the overall body mass, as well as some interesting differences in the skull's anatomy. Looking at these recesses in this part of the skull called the quadratic jugal bone are different between this skull and the skull of any tyrannosaur. And James Napoli really knows his stuff on this subject because he actually did his PhD thesis on this anatomy of archosaurs, which is the clade that includes crocodiles, birds, pterosaurs, and non-avian dinosaurs. This might seem like a small thing, but this is something that universally does not change as these animals mature. And for even more concrete evidence, we once again have to look at those hands. So, T-Rex hands. Little, memeable, 2 fingers, we all know T-Rex hands. But on top of the limbs of this animal being larger than an animal twice its size, it also had the remnant of a 3rd finger. So what I'm saying is, for this to be a juvenile T-Rex, that would mean that in addition to its limbs shrinking as it grew, it would also need to lose bones in its hand.
That does not make sense.
I mean, yeah, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, and these gloves ain't fitting. But wait, there's more. In addition to all of this, it turns out that after doing a bone histology on Bloody Mary, this animal was an adult around 20 years old. As in, it was pretty much done getting bigger. And this actually makes the entire situation even weirder, because if we look back at Jane the Nanotyrannus at the Burpee Museum, that animal is bigger than Bloody Mary, and I will remind you, Jane was only 11 years old. So Jane still had growing to do. The conclusion is that there was actually 2 separate species of Nanotyrannus living alongside T-Rex. Nanotyrannus lancensis, represented by the smaller Bloody Mary, and Nanotyrannus lethaeus, represented by Jane and Cleveland. And the story about how these animals came to be is actually one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story for me. Alright, now that we're through all of the drama that has taken place around these dead animals, the real question is, what is this? And if it's not a T-Rex, how does it relate to T-Rex and the rest of the Tyrannosaurs? Well, in order to figure that out, Zano and Napoli started comparing the Bloody Mary, Jane, and Cleveland specimens to every bit of Tyrannosaur material they could. And the theory that they put together is a pretty interesting one. Because if this origin story ends up being true, then it turns out that these are even farther removed from T-Rex than we thought. And actually closer related to a branch of the Tyrannosaur family that we're only now starting to get a better understanding of. You see, the Tyrannosaurs were a group of animals that spread across North America and Asia and really started to fill the top predator spot during the late Cretaceous period. But remember, the Cretaceous period was a very long time period. It's actually longer than the entire Cenozoic era that followed and that we're currently in now. So a lot of changes happened during this time, both to the planet as well as the organisms living on it. And one of the big differences between then and now is that North America was actually two separate landmasses. The eastern half being Appalachia and the western being Laramidia, with this shallow inland sea that we call the Western Interior Seaway dividing them. Which is why we actually find tons of marine fossils like fish, ammonites, and mosasaurs in places like Kansas. The thing is, the ancestors of both Nanotyrannus and T-Rex lived in North America before this seaway formed. So when it did, it isolated the early Tyrannosaurs into two separate populations in the west and in the east. And from there, these two populations just kept doing Tyrannosaur things. But with these two populations isolated from one another, they would slowly become more and more distinct from each other as they adapted to the changes in their separate worlds. In Laramidia in the west, the Tyrannosaurs would keep getting bigger and gaining a stronger, more devastating bite, as they slowly started losing the need to use their arms as weapons, and thus becoming big guys like Daspletosaurus and T-Rex. But in the east, across Appalachia, the Tyrannosaurs remained more nimble and fleet-footed. For a long time, we actually didn't know much about the dinosaurs in the eastern half of the United States, because fossils have been historically much more rare than in the west. However, in the past decade or so, there have been several new sites found from the late Cretaceous Appalachia, like the Edelman Fossil Park in New Jersey, as well as a couple others. So now, we have a better picture of the eastern half of the US at this time. And among these new finds were a few new tyrannosaurs like Dryptosaurus and Appalachiosaurus. And these ones have longer arms than what we see in the Laramidian tyrannosaurs. So the theory is that Nanotyrannus is actually closer related to these eastern tyrannosaurs. But then the question remains, if that's true, how did these two species of Nanotyrannus end up living alongside T-Rex by the end of the Cretaceous? Well, you may notice that there is currently not an inland sea dividing North America in half. And we think that the sea that used to be there was already starting to shrink by the time of Nanotyrannus and T-Rex. And with this seaway receding, it allowed the populations that had been separated for tens of millions of years to come back into contact with each other. But in that time, the populations had evolved into Tyrannosaurus rex and Nanotyrannus. But because Nano was around half the size of T-Rex or less, they were able to live alongside one another without one or the other going extinct. Now, Nanotyrannus and T-Rex definitely competed. After all, Bloody Mary was found alongside one of T-Rex's favorite foods. But because one would have been geared for hunting a lot of the things that T-Rex probably would have considered more trouble than it's worth, the two animals were able to get by alongside one another right up until the end of the Age of Dinosaurs. One thing that I do want to say is that this is part of an ongoing study. Technically, at the time of writing this, the full details of James Napoli and Lindsay Zano's research has not been fully made available. And this is going to undoubtedly spark many more studies into Tyrannosaur specimens from all over North America and Asia.
Yeah, Steve, there's already a new Daspletosaurus that's being described apparently.
Yep, this is going to be fun. In the coming months and years, our understanding will continue to change as more information is gathered. What we know now is that this is not a Tyrannosaurus rex, but some of the details that I talked about today could eventually be disproven. And that is okay. In fact, it's better than okay. That's good science. I want to thank Lindsay Zano and James Napoli for their contributions to our understanding of these extinct animals. But I do feel like there is one other person who definitely deserves some credit here. Because like I said earlier, I'm not going to sit here and say that I knew Nanotyrannus was a distinct genus. But someone did. And he was willing to present this information to me or anyone else who went to Black Hills Institute and asked him about those hand bones that he had in that display case. And had I made something about that, talking about it 5 years ago, my credibility as a science communicator would have been called into question. And that's not good science. Because there was an argument to be had here. But now, it's official. Nanotyrannus is real. Again, thank you to Lindsay Zano. Thank you to James Napoli. And thank you to Pete Larson. Y'all did good science. Cheers. Have a good one, everybody.